On today's episode, I'm sharing the top 7 lessons I've learned about interviewing from doing this podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show about life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Subscribe to the podcast, share us on social media, and drop us a line. I'd love to hear from you. And details to everything are available at our website, contrabassconversations.com. Now, today's episode is a little bit of a departure from our normal interview episode or these series episodes like Winning the Audition that we've been doing. I wrote a 3-part series for Drew McManus's site, Arts Hacker, wonderful site, by the way, earlier this year. And this got my brain going. Start to think, what if I put out some pulling back the curtain podcasts about how I do all of this stuff that I do in terms of the podcast and what I've learned in the process. And so that's what today's episode is going to be. And I'm actually breaking this down into 2 parts. I thought that made the most sense. So today's episode is what I'm calling the art of the interview, where I talk about what I've learned doing this. I'm going to share 7 lessons that I've discovered through this process. Many of them I never would have imagined when I started this podcast. And then the next episode, we're going to go deep into the nitty-gritty, into the technology behind recording, behind editing, and behind putting out these episodes. And you know, podcasters like me, we end up having this strange skill set where we're half talk show host and half IT guy. And while some of the bigger podcasters split these duties into different team members, the vast majority of podcasters, and this includes me, fill both of these roles. So a little bit about how I discovered podcasting. I discovered podcasts right around when I got my first iPod video. I think this was 2005. And my very first podcast was this wonderful show, it's still running, called This Week in Tech with Leo Laporte, who, by the way, I've actually seen live. He tapes his show here in the Bay Area up in Petaluma, California. My wife and I went up to the Twit studio to see a live taping of This Week in Tech. It was awesome. So I was hooked from the get-go, and it wasn't too long before I started thinking, what if I did my own podcast? In fact, one of the first things I looked up was Double Bass Podcast, and I found something. Peter Jones, I believe his name is, was doing a podcast called the Double Bass Cast, and he did a few episodes, and he hadn't done one in a while. And it looked like he had pod faded. That's the term for when you ride your horse off into the sunset when you do a podcast. And the podcast sort of lives on, but it's not updating. So I saw that Peter wasn't doing it anymore. I thought, boy, I'd love to do this. And I filed that urge away for about a year. My blog was growing, and I was having a good time kind of riding that wave. But the more I got into blogging, the more I thought how cool it would be to actually have my own podcast. And I was loving listening to interview shows, and I'd actually broadened my listening to include about 20 podcasts at that point. It was basically all that I listened to outside of music. It had supplanted any talk radio, any TV even. Now, as 2006 progressed, I decided I'm going to start my own show, and the latter half of that year, I was purchasing gear, I was setting up a website, I was getting hosting, and I was working on using this gear. So I did a couple unreleased test episodes, which I will never release. They're hilariously bad and not that interesting, actually. And I put out my very first podcast on January 1st, 2007. So recording yourself makes most people self-conscious, and that includes me as well. Listening back to yourself as a host can be super awkward. And like most people, I hated how I sounded on the mic. You know, you sound so different than you do in your own head, of course. And I really didn't know how to use the gear that I had very well. So it was trial by fire. I had this hilariously bad Acer laptop at the time, which caused all sorts of problems early on. But I'll save those details for the tech episode. I've got some good examples of what not to do on the tech end for next time. I put out what I just decided was a pretty decent first episode, just kind of stating the purpose of the show and what I hope to do. And the funny thing is, I've done pretty much exactly what I said in that first episode. I went back not too long ago and I listened to that episode, and I was expecting some truly cringeworthy material, but actually it sounded a lot better than I thought it would. My first 3 episodes, I had no guests. It was just me rambling into the microphone, and it's amazing to hear how I sound so stilted when I go back and listen to that. And it was all new to me, and that's the first big lesson I have for this episode. No matter how well-versed you may be in public speaking, it takes time to find your own rhythm and your own voice in front of a microphone for a podcast. And imitating someone else may work at first. It certainly does, but ultimately you end up having to find your own style, and it's not easy. Now, my first guests, I finally got my first guest on episode 4. That was Andy Anderson from the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And actually, I still think it's one of my best episodes. And I'm eternally thankful to him for being willing to take a chance on something like that. It was challenging approaching people in the early days. You get the question, who are you and what's a podcast and why should I be on it? Understandable questions, especially in 2007. But Andy's an incredibly open guy and was such an amazing first guest. He made it so easy for me. I can think of a lot of other people that I interviewed after that, and I think, what if that had been my first interview and how challenging that would have been. But Andy was amazing and was really helpful for building up my confidence in this arena. I mean, I was really making it up on the spot. I did not know what I was doing. Now, I'd listened to podcasts for a while at that point, and I'd absorbed a lot of interviews and interview styles. But let me tell you, doing your own interview is a totally different animal. It can feel kind of formal and weird, and I actually think it's one of those deceptively difficult skills. It seems easy when it's done well, but in reality, it's incredibly challenging to do at a high level. I feel like it takes every skill and experience that I've had to do an interview. I feel like I bring that into every interview, which actually makes it very satisfying. And it's a wonderful exercise, if nothing else, in self-improvement. It forces you to become a better listener. And I think that I've actually become a better listener just in my life in general as a result of this podcast, an unexpected and very cool benefit. So here are the 7 lessons I've learned from doing this podcast. Lesson number 1 is about starting an interview. And if I go back and I listen to my first episodes, I do hear moments of quality in those first episodes, but I kind of cringe as I hear what I call extended resume type questions. I did this a lot early on. I've tried to move away from it. It's harder than you might think, but what I mean is, you went to this school, then you went to this school, then you auditioned for this orchestra, then this orchestra, then this orchestra. And I still start basically all interviews with some talk about the musician's early years, but I no longer expect to talk about each minute detail of their progression through school, training, and employment. It's not necessarily that interesting. I mean, it is sometimes, and if so, that's very cool. But what I do now is I listen intently to what they're saying, and I'm listening for any sort of interesting twist in their path or any extra passion in their voice about some particular aspect of their upbringing. And I try to hone onto that, and that's where we go next. And a tip I picked up from Tim Ferriss, love Tim Ferriss's podcast. If you don't listen to it, it's one of the best out there. And so a tip I picked up from him is I try to talk with a person for at least 10 minutes before actually starting the interview, and especially if I haven't met them in the past. And this makes for a way less stilted conversation. And I think a concern people have is that you're going to blow all your good content in the pre-interview, and then it'll be stale when you're actually recording. And that is definitely possible danger, but I think the benefits of chatting for a while far outweigh the disadvantages. And you don't have to start talking about their life and that kind of thing. Even the weather, where you may have met, friends you have in common, anything like that can really relax both parties in the interview process. And I've also stopped being so formal at the beginning of interviews. It just feels more natural to me. I used to always talk and then say, okay, let's stop. And I say, welcome to Contra-Based Conversations and that sort of thing. But if you listen to the podcast for the long haul, you'll notice that at a certain point, I just quit welcoming my guest formally like that. It just felt like an interruption and it seemed a little too stilted and it really didn't add anything to the podcast. And if anything, it hurt the podcast because it kind of kicked us out of that natural flow we had and it made people clamp up just a little bit. We'd been nice and relaxed talking. All of a sudden, I welcome that they realize, oh, I'm on a show. Now I must be careful about how I'm presenting myself. And I think that actually was a detriment to some of my interviews. Now I just sort of go into it. Chris Hardwick with The Nerdist, he does the same thing. It's just boom, go, we're interviewing, and let the chips fall where they may. And you get a much more honest and kind of open conversation that way. So that's lesson 1, starting an interview. Now, lesson number 2 is about coaxing out good content. My philosophy is that people I'm interviewing have a story to tell, but if I can't get that out of them, it's my fault as an interviewer. And I have to ride the wave of that discussion and find what's most interesting and then follow that up. And that can be easy or stupidly challenging depending on the guest. And fortunately, I've picked up a few techniques from some of my favorite interviewers. Most notably, I've mentioned a couple of them, Tim Ferriss, Chris Hardwick, and Mark Maron. And some great techniques that they use are phrasing questions in a way like, tell me the story of, or even something as simple as, what was that like? That's a Mark Maron favorite. You hear him do that all the time. But you know what? Those work really well. Questions that you can answer yes or no to are a little dangerous because there's not a clear call for the guest to elaborate. And some will anyway, even if you do that. And I still ask yes or no questions, but others won't. And so I found, tell me the story. Tell me about a time in your life. What was that experience like? Those are really effective questions for going to the next level, going to a deeper level. And you know, some people are just more reflective and more verbal than others. And with time and experience in doing these week after week after week, you start to pick up within a few minutes. And this is another reason why you don't want to dive into the interview immediately. You want to talk to them and get into their rhythm and their speech patterns and tap into how their brain works. And you'll discover within a few minutes what sort of guest they're probably going to be. And then it's my job to adjust my interview style to fit with their rhythm and to try to make them feel comfortable and open up and suss out the interesting content from them. So how to figure out what is going to be interesting in a particular guest, that's where research comes into play. And lesson number 3 that I've learned is research strategies. And for me, researching is key to doing a good interview. And I start the process for every guest the same. I've been doing it pretty much since the beginning this way. I start a new note in Evernote, my favorite app for everything, for this upcoming guest. And I then devour anything and everything I can find online about that individual. And that can be easy or challenging. Facebook's an option if they don't have a website. YouTube is an option a lot of the time. My Evernote document quickly becomes filled with biographical information, YouTube links, photos, audio examples, and the like. And as I read and as I watch and listen, I start to jot down potential questions. And through this process, I'm looking for the key things that make that person's story unique. What I used to do that I do not do anymore, I used to have a set of stock questions. I really think the only stock question I ever ask, and I still ask it because it's just a good starting point, is what was your first musical instrument? Or tell me about your early years in music or on the bass or that sort of thing. I know that some podcasters start with what is definitely going to be the most interesting thing about that person, and you just dive right in. And I have thought about doing that, but all of my interviews end up being longer form, 30 minutes, an hour and a half, even depending on the guest. And I think the reason that people do that, start with the most interesting first, is they're worried that their interview is only going to last for 5 minutes. And if they don't get that, they're never going to get it. And that's typically not the case with what I do. So I find that starting at the beginning and then seeing what little things sparkle in what they're talking about, to me, that is a technique that I like. So lesson number 3 is about research strategies. Lesson number 4 is formulating good questions. And I used to send every interview guest the same set of stock questions. And this ended up leading to the same kind of interview for everyone, the same formula. And over time, I quit using that. And I approach each new interview with a totally blank slate. I don't copy anything from anything else, totally blank, blinking cursor. And even though some guests are going to have certain commonalities with other guests, their education, their career path, the genre that they're in musically, I just find that I get a better interview if I start from scratch every single time. And I think that things got a lot better for my interviews when I quit trying to shoehorn everybody through the same ringer of questions that I come with. I had 30 questions I used to set out to everybody. And then since people are going to be guests on my show, they try to find answers to those exact questions. And really that's not an approach I would recommend to anybody doing this kind of thing. So as I said, under lesson number 2, questions that can be answered yes or no are a little dangerous. So if I ask one, I try to follow up with the what was that like type of questions. You don't have to have super complex questions to have effective questions, but a string of yes or no statements is just not that interesting to listen to. Now, lesson number 5, I find this interesting, and I came to this kind of late. Plan like crazy, but improvise in the moment. And I write a lot of potential questions for a guest before an interview. I have a lot. And I'll sometimes share these questions if requested by a guest, or if I feel that it'll enhance the interview, if that guest could use a little prompting. Typically, if they don't request them, I'll typically not send them unless I find something a little off the beaten path in my research that I'd like to dig into, but I don't ever want to surprise a guest with a question. The point of my podcast is not to do any gotcha sort of thing. So I will send something out, hey, this could be an interesting thing to talk about. If you want to, that could be great. If not, that's fine too. But I'm trying to balance preparation and spontaneity in what I do. So I don't want things to be overly scripted from either of us either. It's definitely a balancing act, and it's different for every single guest. And I'm still trying to find that balance. And that's part of what's satisfying about this is the challenge of that. Now, in the interview itself, and this is a change that happened within the last year or so, I almost never look at those questions. I write them out like crazy. I have a ton of them. And then I never look at them, or rarely look at them when I'm actually interviewing somebody. I try to go with the flow. And it's only if I feel like we're grinding to a halt that I'll look. My hope is I've internalized a lot of those questions too, or possible paths to go down. And a technique that I've picked up recently, and I don't know if I found this somewhere or it came to me one day, but I make sure to ask every guest at the end, was there anything we didn't dig into that you wanted to get out there? Was there any topic? I feel like we're leaving something out. And, every single time I've asked that, we do talk about something else, and that ends up being one of the most interesting things, which is kind of humbling, puts you in your place as an interviewer. You're like, oh, great, I didn't even cover the most interesting thing. But I've gotten such gold out of that one simple thing. So if you end up doing any sort of interview like this, podcasting or otherwise, that's a great question. And you've already gone through and you've already talked about all sorts of topics, but there's almost always something of value that comes from that question. So great technique. I'm going to keep doing that for sure. Now, lesson number 6 is give your guest final edit. And like I said earlier, the intent of my podcast is never for it to be a gotcha kind of show. The intent is to make my guests look good and learn more about their unique story. And so with that in mind, I let them know that I edit. So anything that they say and they want to restate can be easily changed. And also, I'll send them a link. They can listen to the interview before it goes out and suggest any changes, and I'll make those changes. So they have final edit on anything that I put out. Now, that knowledge takes pressure off of the guest to be perfect in the moment, to phrase everything perfectly. And it also allows us the luxury of exploring tangents and taking chances. And if it doesn't work out, no big deal. I can always chop it out. Now, there's a flip side to that we'll get into with the technical aspects of this. That creates a lot of work for the podcaster. And we'll talk about that in the next episode on the tech. And the last lesson number 7, is talk about myself, share my own stories. And doesn't that seem kind of egotistical? Well, maybe, but it's a technique I picked up from Tim Ferriss. I think I was doing it unconsciously anyway, but I've really incorporated it. It's a great technique if you can use it correctly because it encourages the guest to be more open. And if I start by relating something I've struggled with, it makes it more likely that my guest will feel comfortable sharing something in similar fashion. It breaks down those barriers and it leads to a more open and honest conversation and just much better content. And you got to be careful with this technique because I don't want it to turn into the Jason Heath show. I am the host, but it's not the point of the show. But if you can use it right, it works wonders with making that human connection and just bringing out honesty. And again, Tim Ferriss is a master of the technique, and he's got an episode about this, and I'll link to that in the show notes for this. So I've done this subconsciously, but I've really made it a practice, and I found that it's helped a lot in just the overall flow of the interview. So for me, interviewing is a skill. It's just like any other skill, practicing, that sort of thing. It requires practice and repetition. And it's satisfying, it's challenging. And one cool thing about the whole interview preparation and execution process is it requires me to formulate questions. And that helps me ask better questions just in general, which is such a great skill in life. It's a self-education process for sure. And I don't think I realized that when I started podcasting, but I've realized that recently. And I find that I get done with an interview and I hang up and I say to myself, and I say this so frequently, that's the best use of that hour I ever could have had. I'm so glad that I had that hour with this person. I've learned so much. I've grown. I feel inspired, energized. So, and I love putting this content out there, but it's also a journey for me, and it's incredibly satisfying for me. So those are 7 lessons about interviewing that I've learned doing this podcast for the last 10 years. And this is part 1 of a 2-parter. Part 2 will be about the technology, all the nitty-gritty, microphones, software, hardware, how you distribute this stuff, things I've done that I wish I hadn't done, lessons I've learned. And I'm just hoping that these 2 episodes be helpful for somebody who's maybe thinking of starting a podcast or a YouTube channel or any sort of content like that. And again, thank you for hanging out with me for these 20 minutes. And we'll be back in a few days with more life on the low end of the spectrum.